The day the city inspector handed my neighbor a compliance order thick enough to stop a door from closing, I almost laughed, not because I'm the kind of guy who enjoys watching other people get into trouble, but because 2 weeks earlier that same neighbor had stood in my driveway and explained, with complete confidence, that privacy was basically an outdated hobby and that people like me simply needed to catch up with the modern world. Standing there on my front porch that morning, watching a licensed contractor remove a surveillance camera that never should have been attached to my house in the first place, I realized something funny about people who become obsessed with control. They eventually convince themselves that rules only exist for everyone else. The whole mess started after I spent nearly 3 years restoring my home. Not flipping it, not renovating it for social media photos, just restoring it because I loved the place. It sat on a quiet lot outside a small North Carolina town, far enough from the city to enjoy some peace, but close enough that I could still get to work without spending half my life in traffic. The house was a brick ranch built in the 1950s, the kind of home that had good bones but needed patience. Every room had a story. Every repair felt personal. I replaced old wiring, refinished hardwood floors, rebuilt cabinets, and slowly turned a neglected property into a place that actually felt like home. One of the very first things I installed was a bronze porch light beside the front door. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't fancy, but it looked like it belonged there. Every evening when I pulled into the driveway after work, that warm light greeted me. It became part of my routine, one of those small details you stop noticing until somebody takes it away. For 2 years, everything stayed quiet. Then my new neighbor arrived. His name was Darren Holt, and if you asked Darren, he wasn't just a security consultant, he was apparently the future of civilization. The guy owned a small surveillance installation company, specialized in commercial camera systems, and somehow managed to bring up security technology in almost every conversation. He wore mirrored sunglasses constantly, even on cloudy days, and talked to people the way a college professor talks to students who forgot to do the reading assignment. The first time we spoke, I was trimming bushes near the property line. Darren wandered over, looked at my porch, and asked if I planned on upgrading my outdated lighting system. I remember laughing because I genuinely thought he was joking. I told him I liked simple things. A light switch worked perfectly fine for me. He smiled in this strange way that never quite reached his eyes and said, "People who refuse to adapt usually get left behind." It was such a weird thing to say during a casual neighborhood conversation that I just nodded and went back to trimming hedges. Looking back, I probably should have paid more attention. About a week later, I left town for a long weekend. Nothing exciting, just a short trip to visit family. When I came back Sunday evening, I pulled into my driveway and immediately felt something was off. You know that feeling when your brain notices a detail before you consciously process it? That's exactly what happened. I parked, stepped out of the truck, looked toward the front porch, and froze. My porch light was gone. Completely gone. In its place sat a black dome surveillance camera mounted directly where my light fixture used to be. At first I honestly thought I was losing my mind. I walked closer. The mounting plate was attached to the same junction box. The camera lens pointed directly toward my driveway and front yard. Then I noticed the cable. A thin black wire ran neatly along the siding of my house, crossed the property boundary, and disappeared onto Darren's property. That was the moment my confusion turned into anger. Somebody had physically removed part of my house and replaced it with their own equipment. I walked next door and knocked hard enough that I didn't have to wait long. Darren opened the door halfway. The second he saw my face, he already knew why I was there. "What happened to my porch light?" I asked. He didn't apologize. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he leaned against the door frame and said, "Oh, that. You're welcome." I actually thought I heard him wrong. "Excuse me." He pointed toward my house and said, "It's part of a neighborhood security initiative. The camera covers your front approach. I manage the feed. It improves overall safety." I stared at him for a few seconds because I honestly couldn't believe another adult was saying these words out loud. Then I told him to remove it immediately. Darren shrugged. "You can't fight progress." He said it like he was delivering some profound wisdom instead of admitting he'd tampered with somebody else's property. The future is surveillance. People only complain because they don't understand the technology. That was the moment I stopped arguing. Not because I agreed with him. Not because I was intimidated. But because I suddenly realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. Darren genuinely believed he had the authority to make decisions about other people's property if those decisions matched his personal vision of how things should work. And people like that are almost impossible to reason with. So instead of debating him, I walked back to my house and started documenting everything. I photographed the camera from every angle. I photographed the wiring. I photographed the mounting hardware. I photographed the cable crossing the property line. I even zoomed in on the manufacturer information and serial numbers. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, looked through the photos, and felt something shift in my head. Darren thought this was a conversation. Darren thought this was a disagreement between neighbors. What he didn't realize was that the second he touched my electrical system and installed surveillance equipment onto my property without permission, he had turned the situation into something much bigger. And by the next morning, I was already making the calls that would eventually bring city code enforcement directly to his front door. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of people accidentally make a huge mistake. When someone crosses a line like Darren did, most folks immediately focus on the argument. They start yelling, threatening lawsuits, posting on Facebook, or trying to win some neighborhood popularity contest. According to standard procedure, that's usually the worst possible move. From a legal perspective, the moment somebody modifies electrical equipment on property they don't own, installs surveillance hardware without authorization, or creates physical alterations across a property boundary, the issue stops being personal and starts becoming regulatory. That's important because regulators don't care who won the argument. They care about documentation, permits, safety codes, and compliance. This is a psychological trap many controlling personalities fall into. They become so convinced they're right that they stop asking whether they're allowed to do something. They confuse confidence with authority. The lesson here is simple. When somebody believes they're above the rules, don't waste energy trying to out-argue them. Let the rules introduce themselves. The next morning I called a licensed electrician before I called anybody else. I wanted an expert opinion before emotions got involved. Around 9 o'clock a guy named Mike pulled into my driveway, took one look at the camera attached to my house, and immediately frowned. He spent about 20 minutes examining the installation, tracing the wiring, checking the junction box, and taking measurements. The longer he looked, the less amused he seemed. Finally, he climbed down from the ladder and said, "Whoever did this had no business touching your electrical system." That was the first sentence that made me feel like I wasn't overreacting. Then he explained that the installation wasn't permitted, the modifications weren't documented, and the equipment had been connected through infrastructure that didn't belong to the person operating it. In plain English, somebody had treated my house like it was their own project. Mike gave me a written assessment and suggested I contact the city's code compliance department immediately. By lunchtime, I had already submitted photographs, notes, timestamps, and the electrician's findings. I expected the process to take weeks. Instead, things moved surprisingly fast. 2 days later, a city inspector named Rebecca arrived. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't emotional. She was the kind of person who looked at problems the same way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. She walked around my property, took photographs, examined the wiring, and followed the cable until it crossed directly into Darren's yard. I watched her expression change ever so slightly. Not outrage, not surprise, more like recognition, like she'd seen this type of personality before. She asked a few questions, wrote several notes, then looked at me and said quietly, "Continue documenting everything." Those 4 words told me more than any official statement could have. Something about this situation was already setting off alarms. 3 days after the inspection, Darren made his move. I came home from work and found an envelope shoved under my front door. It came from an attorney. At first, I thought maybe Darren had finally realized how serious things were and wanted to resolve the matter. I was wrong. The letter claimed the camera installation was a temporary evaluation project intended to improve neighborhood security. It described the entire thing as a misunderstanding. Then it got even better. Darren offered to provide me with copies of any recorded footage for transparency purposes, as if access to recordings he never had permission to collect somehow solved the problem. But the best part was on the final page. His attorney suggested that if I wanted the equipment professionally removed, I should consider sharing part of the removal expense. I must have read that paragraph 3 times because I couldn't believe it was real. Darren had removed my porch light, mounted his surveillance equipment onto my house, connected it to his own system, and now wanted me to help pay for the cleanup. I actually laughed out loud standing in my kitchen. The thing about arrogance is that it often becomes most visible right before impact. About a week later, the impact arrived. A certified notice from the city appeared in Darren's mailbox. Then another. Then another. Apparently, the investigation had expanded beyond the initial complaint. Inspectors reviewed permits. They reviewed electrical records. They reviewed installation standards. They reviewed property modification regulations. What started as a single camera issue was turning into a complete examination of Darren's actions. One afternoon, I happened to be outside watering plants when Darren stormed across his lawn holding a stack of papers. "Did you report me?" he demanded. I looked at him for a second and said, "You installed a camera on my house." His jaw tightened. "You're blowing this completely out of proportion." That sentence fascinated me because people rarely realize how much they reveal when they're angry. Darren wasn't denying what happened. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't claiming there had been confusion. He was upset because somebody else had challenged his authority. "You could have just talked to me," he said. I almost laughed. We had talked. The day I discovered the camera. The day he told me I couldn't fight progress. The day he thanked me for a surveillance system I never requested. But I didn't bother arguing. Rebecca's advice echoed in my head. Document everything. So I simply said, "Good luck with the city," and went back to watering my plants. That answer seemed to bother him more than any insult could have. Over the next several days, I noticed subtle signs that things weren't going well for him. Contractors visited his property. Inspectors returned multiple times. More certified letters arrived. His normally confident attitude started cracking around the edges. The man who once spoke like he owned the future now looked like someone trying to stop a flood with a bucket. Then the official compliance order arrived. 14 days. That was the deadline. 14 days to remove the unauthorized equipment. 14 days to restore the damaged property. 14 days to correct the violations and absorb every associated cost. The order listed multiple findings. Unauthorized electrical modifications. Property interference. Improper installation practices. Potentially unlawful data collection concerns. Reading through the document felt surreal. Not because I was happy Darren was in trouble, but because the entire situation had been so unnecessary. None of this would have happened if he had simply respected a basic boundary. My house. My property. My decision. Instead, he had convinced himself that expertise gave him permission. It didn't. The morning of the compliance deadline felt strangely calm. A licensed contractor arrived with city authorization. Rebecca arrived shortly afterward carrying a clipboard. Another official accompanied her to document the process. Darren stood in his driveway watching everyone gather around my front porch. He looked exhausted. Angry too, but mostly exhausted. The contractor climbed the ladder and began removing the dome camera. For the first time in weeks, I could clearly see the damage left behind. Additional holes. Modified mounting hardware. Evidence that somebody had treated my home like a test platform. Piece by piece, the equipment came down. The wiring disappeared. The cable crossing the property line vanished. Then the contractor opened a box and pulled out something I hadn't seen since the day I returned from my trip. My porch light. The original bronze fixture had been preserved as evidence during the investigation. Seeing it again felt oddly emotional. The contractor carefully reinstalled it into the original junction box, secured the mounting plate, completed the connections, and tested the circuit. A warm yellow glow appeared against the brick wall, even though it was still daylight outside. It looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. Simple. Ordinary. Mine. That's when Darren finally lost his composure. "This is ridiculous," he snapped loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm considering legal action." Rebecca slowly looked up from her clipboard. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sarcastic. If anything, she sounded tired. "Mr. Holt," she said, "you're already fortunate criminal complaints aren't being pursued." The silence afterward felt enormous. Darren opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd met him, he had absolutely nothing to say. The contractor packed his tools. The officials completed their documentation. The compliance order was marked satisfied. Just like that, the entire conflict was over. No dramatic courtroom battle. No screaming match. No revenge scheme. Just consequences. That evening I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, the bronze fixture switched on automatically. A warm circle of light spread across the porch steps. It looked exactly the same as it had before Darren ever arrived. The difference was how I felt looking at it. Because that little porch light no longer represented a renovation project. It represented something much bigger. It reminded me that boundaries matter. Ownership matters. Accountability matters. And no matter how confident somebody sounds when they tell you the rules don't apply to them, reality eventually shows up carrying paperwork. A couple of weeks after everything ended, life quietly returned to normal. The inspectors stopped coming. The contractors disappeared. The certified letters stopped arriving in mailboxes. The neighborhood moved on to the usual things people talk about: lawn care, weather forecasts, rising grocery prices, and whose dog keeps escaping the backyard. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing significant had happened. But every time I pulled into my driveway after work and saw that porch light glowing exactly where it belonged, I found myself thinking about how strange the entire experience really was. The funny thing is, this story was never actually about a camera. It wasn't even about a porch light. It was about boundaries. Most of us grow up understanding certain unwritten rules. You don't walk into somebody else's house and rearrange their furniture. You don't borrow their car without asking. You don't make decisions about their property because you think your idea is better than theirs. Yet every now and then someone comes along who slowly convinces themselves that expertise, money, status, education, or confidence somehow gives them permission to override those boundaries. Darren wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't some movie villain sitting in a dark room plotting against the neighborhood. He was something much more common. He was a person who spent so much time believing he was right that he stopped asking whether he had the right to do what he was doing. And honestly, I think that's why situations like this happen so often. This is a psychological trap that affects more people than we realize. When someone becomes deeply attached to their own expertise, they can start viewing disagreement as ignorance. They stop seeing other people as equals and start seeing them as obstacles that need correction. Darren genuinely believed he was improving my property. That's what makes the story so fascinating. He wasn't acting out of confusion. He wasn't trying to hide. He openly admitted what he had done because he thought the outcome justified the action. The problem is that society doesn't function on personal opinions. It functions on rules, permissions, responsibilities, and consequences. According to standard procedure, none of those things become less important simply because somebody thinks they're helping. From a legal perspective, intent matters far less than many people assume. You don't get to bypass property rights because you believe your technology is beneficial. You don't get to alter somebody else's home because you think your solution is smarter. The system exists specifically because every person has a different opinion about what's best. The lesson here is that rights only mean something when they're respected even during disagreement. And I'll be honest, there was a moment early on when I almost handled everything differently. Part of me wanted a shouting match. Part of me wanted to embarrass him publicly. Part of me wanted immediate revenge. But looking back, I'm glad I didn't. The second I stopped arguing and started documenting, everything changed. Facts became stronger than opinions. Evidence became stronger than emotion. And the people responsible for enforcing the rules were able to do their jobs without unnecessary drama getting in the way. That's probably the biggest takeaway from this entire experience. When somebody crosses a serious boundary, don't automatically assume the loudest response is the strongest response. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do is remain calm, collect information, and let the proper process work. It isn't exciting. It isn't cinematic, but it works. In the end, I got my porch light back. Darren got an expensive lesson about authority, and the neighborhood got a reminder that confidence and permission are not the same thing. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered a neighbor had removed part of your property and replaced it with something they personally approved of, how would you have handled it? Would you have confronted them immediately? Would you have called the city first? Or would you have taken a completely different approach? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark interesting debates. And sometimes the most valuable lessons come from hearing how other people would respond when somebody decides that your property somehow belongs to their imagination.